Well, with the current Disney and Sony debacle, Spider-Man will no longer be in the MCU. Yet they're still going to continue from Spider-Man Far From Home, but they aren't allowed to ever mention or reference the MCU in any sort of way, such as Tony Stark or Peter Parker's original suit, which is going to make it complicated. And a lot of us also might think that if Sony reboots it again, they're most likely just going to go back to the origin story and kill off poor Uncle Ben. However, I also have an idea. And this is also a question that many have. How exactly would any of us actually reboot Spider-Man in terms of the live-action movies? Because what if Spider-Man 3 in this situation ends up like, well, it's the Amazing Spider-Man 3. So, what's next in store? What if it gets canceled, and what if Tom Holland gets fired as well, and then they have to get another Spider-Man? None of us want that to happen again. But let's say we all rebooted it again. But what storylines could we base it on? I could say for a fourth attempt at a Spider-Man film and a third reboot, let's say, I would say Ultimate Spider-Man. But here's the problem with that. While I would like to see another, or at least an adaptation of Ultimate Spider-Man, like, here's the problem. It's already been done 3 times. Sam Raimi's Spider-Man has done it. The Amazing Spider-Man movies have done it. And the MCU ones with John Watts have also done it. The Sam Raimi ones, in terms of the origin story. Let's see. Peter Parker in high school goes on a field trip to Oscorp, gets bitten by a radioactive spider. The Green Goblin of that series is also directly linked to Spider-Man's creation. Then, same thing for the Amazing Spider-Man movies. The only difference, not on a high school field trip. This version of Peter Parker has more teenage angst, and also gets bitten by a spider in Oscorp. Then as for the MCU Spider-Man, you don't see his origin, but it's obvious of what it is. However, they do make this version of him younger. So that's one thing they take from Ultimate Spider-Man, but they also take it from Miles as well. Even though Miles is also, at least how he was originally done in the comics, was like a black Peter Parker. Then later on and into the Spider-Verse, they did him as his own character for the most part. So, Ultimate Spider-Man, I like that storyline, or at least that comic series. However, that Spider-Man storyline has actually been done too much, because Spectacular has also done it, and even SpiderMan PS4 also has part of Ultimate Spider-Man within its origin, despite the fact that you don't see the origin, but you do know the costume exists with it. Not just as an alternate costume, but a promotion in Peter's apartment. So what's next? We could try the Steve Ditko Spider-Man. Now, Steve Ditko's has never actually really been, his version of the storyline from Amazing Fantasy issue 15 from 1962 has not really been adapted in modern Spider-Man films. It hasn't really been adapted in Sam Raimi, while the Peter Parker from those movies, Tobey Maguire, has also been more like Steve Ditko's Spider-Man. He's not really, his story hasn't really completely gone that way, and his origin is still based on Ultimate Spider-Man. In fact, do any of you know how recent, or at least at that time for how recent it would be? Because the Ultimate Spider-Man version of the origin came out in 2000, and the version of it in Spider-Man 1 was in 2002. So they just picked up on the most recent one at the time. But Steve Ditko's and his origin, his version of it, Peter Parker still was in high school, but he was also around 16 years old. Then he also gone to, and instead of it being a field trip to Oscorp, he went to a science exhibit for radioactive rays. A spider just so happened to get caught in those rays, and then after it's dying, and then it searches for a person to bite, and then it actually bites Peter Parker. Then later on, Peter discovers that he has these amazing powers, but also uses them for more selfish reasons originally, which Sam Raimi's and Ultimate has also done. Like, let's see. For one instance, the Peter Parker in the Sam Raimi movies, Ultimate Spider-Man, and in Spectacular Spider-Man, all three of these versions of Peter Parker both make their own suit and go into a wrestling ring fighting Crusher Hogan to win money. In Ultimate, he was doing it so he could also help out his aunt and uncle, but this was also so he could get the money to pay for his school bully, or at least when his school bully got injured by Peter. And in the Sam Raimi movies, he was trying to do this so he could try to impress Mary Jane Watson. And as for Spectacular Spider-Man, for the most part it's kind of the same, but his love interest at first was Gwen. Except still, kind of his own selfish reasons so he could also get money. However, all three of these versions, while they did go into the ring and defeat Crusher, they were both tricked, well all three of them were tricked, and didn't get the money that they wanted and earned. Then after, a guy comes into the room and then robs the money. And then after, the manager says, "Spider-Man, stop him! Why didn't you stop him?" And all three of these versions of Peter pretty much say the same thing. Not my problem. And then after, the consequences hit them. Because you know what happens? They find that their Uncle Ben is dying on the ground. Well, only only Ultimate and Sam Raimi's. Because Spectacular didn't see him. Spectacular's was pretty much the same as Steve Ditko's, where he saw the police, but he never saw what happened to Ben, but he knows what happened. And he takes down Dennis Carradine, which was also his Uncle Ben's killer and also the person who stole the money back at the ring. Now, what else do we have here? Let me check my book for a minute. Oh, it says we also have, let's see. We could try maybe an adaptation of Spectacular, but then again, Spider-Man Homecoming looked too similar to it. Because some of the characters in that kind of look like their counterparts from the 2008 Spectacular Spider-Man cartoon. Okay, moving on. Oh, well, this is an interesting one, and actually one that I don't see many talk about. And it's actually a Spider-Man fan film that actually I feel like probably could have been done for the MCU as well. I'll probably leave a link in the description for these videos later on, but this fan film is known as Peter's Web. And Peter's Web is done by a guy by the name of Roger King. And these were made back in 2011. And it was his own reimagining of the storyline. It was kind of like a mixture between Steve Ditko's Spider-Man and Ultimate, which also could have been done for Spider-Man films but never have. And with how impressive, those films are actually kind of impressive. Because they had a low budget, but they made it seem more like a Hollywood film. Except if it was homemade. That's how it looks. And it actually comes off as impressive. In fact, Roger King's Spider-Man outfit kind of looks like Sam Raimi's Peter Parker outfit, the one that Tobey Maguire wore. except if it was more like the comic book Spider-Man, if it had more comic book feel than more of a billion-dollar Hollywood suit, like how the Raimi suit looked and kind of like how some of the other movie costumes look. Or at least that's one I can think of that would work. Like where they mix the two together, and also this version of Peter actually kind of does act a little bit like Ultimate, but it's kind of like Steve Ditko's as well. In fact, part of the origin's also done like Spectacular, where he actually, and Sam Raimi's, where he where certain characters that he knew back in college, well, found, or at least knew in college, he knows in high school. So like, take this for example. He didn't meet MJ, Harry Osborn, or Gwen Stacy in his high school years. The only one he knew in his high school years at first was Liz. But later on, it would be Mary Jane, Harry Osborn, and Gwen Stacy. But this happened in the Ultimate Comics where he knew all four. And now before I get on to the next few suggestions that I have on this list, I also have to mention that Peter's Web was technically a fan film series, well, a series that was actually 6 issues / 6 seasons. The first one is known as Becoming the Spider. Well, I forgot what the name of the rest of them were, but I'll say this. The beginning starts with how the series will end, or at least gives you a glimpse of how it will end, with Peter being attacked by the Sinister Six and about to die, but it doesn't show what happens. But then after, it goes to his origin story, but sort of like a version of Spider-Man 1 if it was a fan film. Speaking of Sam Raimi, why don't we talk about the one Spider-Man film that a lot of people were asking for? And that, of course, is Sam Raimi's canceled Spider-Man 4. Let's say we gone back to the Raimi trilogy, which I would actually like it if they did a crossover between all 3 live-action movie Spider-Man. But that's probably not going to happen anytime soon now. Anyway, let's say we brought back the original cast. So, Tobey Maguire as Peter Parker, and Kristen Dunst as Mary Jane Watson. And probably bring back Bruce Campbell to make one more cameo, but this time as Mysterio, like how he was originally planned. We finally got a movie debut for Mysterio in Far From Home, and if you want my opinion, I'll say that was great. In my opinion, it was. Not to mention that the person who played him, Jake Gyllenhaal, was actually supposed to replace Tobey Maguire for Spider-Man 2 at one point. Moving on, I'm getting off topic. Anyway, so Spider-Man 4, the way a lot of us imagine it, and how I can also see it, is that the version of Peter for this would obviously be the one from the Sam Raimi movies, except he's also the version of Peter Parker from Into the Spider-Verse, the one who trained Miles, the one who was at his lowest lows, who experienced everything that happened through Spider-Man's 1, 2, and 3. And because he's at his lowest lows now, let's just say that either this takes place before or after Spider-Verse, or maybe even a sort of parallel universe, or at least a parallel path for, let's say, he never got tied into the Spider-Verse, and instead he's a retired Peter Parker. Let's say he's in his early or late 40s, which is actually the age that Tobey's in now, so he fits the role perfectly for a retired Peter Parker, but he didn't really fit the role for a teenage one because he was 30 around the time that movie was done. But, Anyway, so like I was saying, at this point he will be a retired version of Peter Parker. After the events of Spider-Man 3, he decided to quit being Spider-Man once and for all. However, crime has actually got a lot worse ever since he stopped being Spider-Man. And there haven't really been any other heroes since. In fact, he was really the only other hero out there. And after the Venom attack, he just decided to lay low. Except everybody else would also wonder whatever happened to Spider-Man. Then a new villain known as the Vulture would come around and actually cause a more dastardly plan than, let's say, Green Goblin, except in this storyline he also has help from Black Cat, which Spider-Man meets up with, except now this is my version of it, so I'm going to tie it into the video games a little bit. Let's say when Spider-Man sees Black Cat, he recognizes her, and it plays to a flashback that's similar to what happens in the Spider-Man 2 video game, where when Peter found out that MJ was dating J. Jonah Jameson's son, John Jameson, let's just say that she spotted him on the rooftops, and then after a chase scene happened with Peter and the Black Cat. And there would also be a few sequences where you see them team up. And then after, let's say that also like the Spider-Man 3 video game, Dr. Connors was also recording a tape to his family or at least recording a tape, and also wanted to make sure that his family was alright if he was gone or if anything in the experiment went wrong. And while he did get his arm back, it also gave him excruciating pain and turned him into a giant lizard. And now Spider-Man also has to take down the lizard, but also is wondering who is he, and then later on finds out that it's someone very close to him, Dr. Connors. This is only half of that. This is just a thought for the synopsis for what it could be. Anyway, speaking of Spider-Man 4, it kinda is already in development. Well, kinda. It's actually a small company that's making it. It's not Sony who's making it. It's actually a fan film known as the Spider-Man 4 fan film being made by High Mountain Studios. And they're actually working very hard on it. In fact, they recently got the suit for the movie. And it said that the film might release in summer of 2020. And I should hope I should still be around to see it if nothing bad happens. Okay. Anyway, then here's another one. Another one which I find kind of very unlikely. And this one is TASM 3. Which is also what almost led to the end of Sony, or at least the Amazing Spider-Man movies kind of almost led to it, and almost the end of Spider-Man's movie career. Okay, anyway, so let's say it's kind of similar to Spider-Man 4, where the main character is retired from being Spider-Man, except it takes place after the events of what happened at the end of The Amazing Spider-Man 2, where after Peter fights Rhino, except Peter actually loses and then loses all of his motivation to be Spider-Man. However, let's go to how the script was before. And the actual script sounds like one thing that no one really wants to see for in live action. I would kind of want to see it, but not in this fashion, and it's the Clone Saga. The Clone Saga isn't really something that would be right to be adapted in film. At least for a live action movie it wouldn't, but I guess it would be interesting. At least it sounds interesting, but they would also have Venom in there too, which it seems like Venom might as well be considered the main thing that comes around whenever Spider-Man movies get to the number 3. Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 3, Venom came in. Amazing Spider-Man 3 was planning for Venom and the Venom spin-off. And as for whatever the sequel to Spider-Man Far From Home will be, which is still happening, it's just no longer tied to the MCU. As far as I know, Venom might as well be considered meeting up with Spider-Man now. And for Amazing Spider-Man 3, this version of Peter is also supposed to resurrect the dead. He's supposed to which also means that he's resurrecting Gwen and some other loved ones. Except I'm pretty sure that also means he's probably gonna just end up resurrecting Uncle Ben as well. The storyline just doesn't really make sense to be adapted to film. And then there's one more thing. And actually, since it's first year anniversary is coming up, and since I'm thinking of doing this month as Spider-Man month anyway, I might as well talk about it. SpiderMan PS4. That's right, I said it. It could be possible that it could be adapted to film. I mean, I'm not sure if it would, but I'd say it could work. Well, I mean, especially if you watch reviews like either mine, which barely anyone cared about that, but whatever, and High Top Films, which everyone else's opinions on that is, anyway. So what me and him pretty much said is that the game might as well be considered a Spider-Man movie. And by the way it is, the game is pretty much almost everything that should be in a Spider-Man movie that somehow still hasn't. Which is surprising that even wasn't really in the Raimi films. At least not completely. A version of Peter Parker that's more adjusted, or at least one where the origin story has already passed, and he's already adjusted to his powers for about 8 years. Except it would be too early to already base it on Spider-Man PS4. They could, but it's already a bit too early for it. Like, if they were trying to do it now, it's a bit too early. I mean, sure, they could still reference it in movies. Like, in Spider-Verse, the suit was seen through one of the trailers. I barely was able to see it, but I know it was there. But then there's one more thing I can think of, or at least one that it's kind of far-fetched. I don't think it will work, but let's say another one is maybe they wouldn't start it with Peter Parker this time. Maybe this time they can actually start it with a different character. Perhaps one that you all know, such as Miles Morales as Spider-Man. Except there's a lot of problems with doing that with Miles. For one thing, Into the Spider-Verse, which already perfected his origin, and two, for his live-action version, what can they really do? Because they can't really use any of the traits that the version of the character had from the comics, because all of that was really given to MCU Peter. So, not really sure what they could do. Or they could even do it so where it's an entirely different character. Where it's an entirely different character who gets bitten by another radioactive spider, or maybe something else where it's similar to, well, actually it can't be anything like canon film Spider-Man, that's for sure. And I'm not sure about the Japanese tokusatsu Spider-Man, if that can be done, but there was a Japanese Spider-Man storyline where it's actually really darker. In fact, it's almost nothing like Spider-Man. And this version of the character isn't even Peter. It's actually an entirely different person. And after the person, a pen pal who's also his love interest, well, What's found out is that her brother is actually Electro, and while the Electro in the main comics, his motivations is, well, I mean, he originally just worked on telephone lines and was just an engineer, well, or at least an electrician, but then after just got his powers from a random occurrence. But this version of him did it because he wanted to help, or at least he needed that money to help, or at least help out his family. But he actually dies during that. In fact, there's a lot of death, and there's also parts where this version of Spider-Man also quits and actually has darker thoughts and does things that Peter or any other Spidey wouldn't do. Then there's one more take on Spider-Man, another dark one, which is also a fan film being done too, and that's Noir, a 1930s version of Peter Parker. One where, well, let's say one where his Uncle Ben is instead killed by Vulture, but then after is, well, he then investigates on, well, tries to investigate on his uncle's murderer, but also finds out about a statue of a spider god, and once it breaks, one of the spiders bite him, and then later on he becomes a Spider. Except this storyline also wouldn't work too well. Not to mention that Spider-Man Noir doesn't really look like Spider-Man. He is a Spider-Man, but he doesn't look the part. Excuse me. Now, what could be the best, or at least how I think it could be, what could be the best option if we can't have MCU Spidey, or if something's gonna happen where Far From Home's sequel is gonna get cancelled? I'd say one of the best options is either Spider-Man 4 or adapting Spider-Man PS4, or maybe even trying to do Miles, or try out with a new character entirely. I mean, it could be an interesting take. You could also have a montage with Peter Parker, kind of like Spider-Verse, where, or at least for the Spider-Man 4 version and Spider-Man PS4, just in case some don't know the character, and let's say nobody watched the previous Sam Raimi films, so you could do a montage for that for Spider-Man 4, just in case some forgot or some didn't watch it, so they would be caught up. Well, I kind of spoke too much. Sorry about that, but I'm interested in the topic. But I really do think that there were multiple ways that they can actually do this, but they also need to make sure that they can't screw up. But the best options I see, Spider-Man PS4, Spider-Man 4, and of course, Peter's Web. Or at least a version of Peter's Web that doesn't involve the MCU character, will involve characters from the bigger Marvel universe. This is Neos Gamer signing off. And stay safe, true believers. Excelsior.